prescriptions. Huh? My boss Polly is here. Sure. Somebody's taken my Coke. Did somebody take my Coke away? Shall we make a start? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted you're here, and what a spectacular room to have a really important conversation in. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Hannah Storm. I'm the director of the International News Safety Institute, a journalist who's been working across safety issues, particularly gender-related safety issues, for the last 8 to 10 years with INSI. And before that, I was a journalist for about 12 years, working specifically on humanitarian conflict issues with a gender lens for the BBC, Reuters, and various other places. As I say, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to introduce the panelists first, and then talk a little bit about some work we did a few years ago, putting a perspective and some data to some of the issues around sexual harassment. But first, to my far right and to your left, we have Jasmine Andersson, who is a news and investigations journalist at PinkNews, and she's co-founder of Second Source. And you'll be hearing a lot about Second Source today, and I'm really thrilled that they're part of the organisation of this panel. So it's a fantastic UK-based network that is working to help combat sexual harassment and support women who are experiencing it, and work both with women and men to try to counter it. But we'll hear a lot more about that soon. Next to me is Megha Mohan, who is a senior multimedia reporter at BBC's Digital Current Affairs unit. And there she tells stories on subcultures with a focus on minority women. Sorry, I've cut and pasted that from the... as you can tell, can't you? Okay, there we go. Well, she can describe her experiences better, but she'll be able to talk to us a little bit about some of the other issues that make some of the harassment against certain groups of women journalists more egregious and sometimes more complex. And to my left here, we have Louise Ridley. She's a freelance journalist, but currently heading up news special projects at the Huffington Post, previously worked at BuzzFeed and various other outfits. So I just want to give you a little bit of some of the context around some of the conversations we're having. Obviously, we're in a climate now where, to some extent, it's positive that we're hearing people being able to talk more about some of the experiences they've countered, that in some way there's a light being shone on the situation. And there's a lot of brave women who are talking about their experience as well, and I do applaud every single person who's had that bravery to come forwards. But it's also made us aware of quite how awful the situation and quite how deep-rooted and systemic some of the issues are, and how we're going to fight those. So I'm going to just wave this at you. This is a report called Violence and Harassment Against Women in the News Media that my organisation INSI did with a group called the International Women's Media Foundation about 4 years ago. And I just want to read you a couple of headline figures to set some context to this. So we did this report with about 1,000 journalists. 1,000 female journalists responded to it, and that was across the world. I'm just going to pick out a couple of points about sexual harassment. Nearly half of the respondents said they'd experienced sexual harassment in their jobs. Of 999 total acts reported, the most common were unwanted comments on dress and appearance. The most common locations for harassment were in the office, and the most common perpetrators were categories of co-worker, boss, and supervisor. Interviewees made up about 16% of the total. And the next point I'm going to make here is one of the ones that I find most sad in some ways. Yes, the figures themselves are sad, the statistics, but this really speaks to some of the systemic issues. And that is that less than one-fifth of the respondents said they'd actually reported incidents of sexual harassment. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how we can perhaps help shift that climate of people feeling not able to come forwards. But first I want to turn to my left now, because that's enough of me talking, to Louise, and she's going to talk a little bit about how Second Source came into being, about some of the space in which that's sitting, and some of the kind of conversations you've been having since you came on board there.
Hi everyone. So Second Source is a group of about 20 journalists in the UK. We're all women and we work across the media, so print, digital, newspapers and lots of broadcasts as well. So we all came together in November last year in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein scandal. I'm sure you're all aware of that. As with lots of different industries and probably yourselves as well, people were talking about this, and we found that a lot of journalists were also talking about their personal experiences of harassment or of sort of just behaviour that made them feel uncomfortable as well, a whole range of things in the workplace, from sources, from just going out and about, online harassment, that kind of thing. We didn't know each other before, lots of us, and we came together because one journalist who's not here, called Emily Reynolds, wrote a brilliant piece. She's freelance, and she was talking about all a range of horrible things she's experienced from editors, from sources, all that kind of thing. And she really bravely wrote about this. Another journalist called Rosamund Irwin, who works at the Sunday Times now, saw this, didn't know Emily, but got in touch with her. And from that, a network kind of formed. So Jazz over there came on board, and then a woman called Stephanie Boland, who works for Prospect magazine. And very quickly, this really snowballed, and a big group of us became part of it. At first, we were all talking on WhatsApp, very sort of modern way to come together. People were sharing experiences, sharing bad things they've heard. And this, you know, it was clear that so many people had had really traumatic experiences or were just really concerned and wanted to do something about this. So we ended up meeting up, saying how can we form a campaign or some kind of group or just provide some sort of action to help with this problem. And from that, our group called The Second Source was born. It's a wonderful group of people, and these guys, kind of looking at them, we've got Tara in our group here as well. For me, it's been amazing coming together and getting to know other women journalists across the industry. It's been an amazing support network. And what we're aiming to do with it is sort of multifold. Key is to provide a support network to women journalists or journalists who are male or of any gender who have experienced harassment. So anyone can come to us. We'll offer a kind of supportive ear. We make it really clear we're not trained counsellors, we're not trained lawyers, but we can signpost people onto those support systems that they need. We put on events, we brought people together, and we kind of want to act as a sort of alternative professional network for women, because we know that a lot of news organisations are really male-dominated, and especially if you're young and you're getting into journalism, you might not know where to turn and where to find that kind of support. We're also launching several new things recently, but Jazz is going to talk a bit more about them. So that's us, I think.
Can I just ask you, Louise, what response have you had from within the industry to setting up, to within the wider industry to setting up Second Source?
It was a really positive response. As you know, the sort of media climate around sexual harassment was really discussed. It was really in the media at the time we launched. The media discussion around it has sort of fallen away a bit, which is a shame, but we're continuing our work. And so we had wonderful, warm responses from across the industry. We had loads of people saying how grateful this was. And we did a big event in December that loads of people came to, and people just enjoyed having a kind of open space to talk about this, whether they'd experienced it or not. So yeah, really warm response.
And have you been able to pursue that conversation, or have you felt some of that slipping away?
No, we haven't at all felt it in terms of people caring about this and everyone's understanding that there's a hell of a lot to be done, I would say still. We feel like we're very much at the beginning of this, and we're very committed to what we're doing. It not being discussed as much in the media is a slight shame, I think, and we feel as journalists we have a responsibility to also cover sexual harassment well and keep covering it and cover it in sort of proper, in-depth ways. But no, we definitely feel this is very, very needed and that we're at the beginning of something, I think.
Okay, and just, I mean, we've been speaking a lot about this over the last few months, and we've been speaking a bit about this notion that, you know, sometimes there's an assumption that as a woman in the media working as a journalist, you just have to, you know, put up with it. It's just part and parcel of the work that you do. Have you seen any of that aspect?
Yeah, definitely. I think from when people began to share stories and experiences, it was so clear how commonplace this was and how there's a huge spectrum of behaviour, which everyone has talked about a lot. However serious something is, there's this inclination to brush it away, especially if it's connected to your work, because you may feel there's a huge risk of losing your job, a risk of, I don't know, embarrassment or damage to your career, and also a huge fear that you won't be believed. And we know, especially, again, we're all women journalists in this group, just since November, the amount of sort of online abuse people have got, whether it's related to this or something completely different, is really, really striking. So the amount of abuse and mental health tolls you can face if you speak out about this kind of thing is significant. So yeah, it's a daily thing and it's a commonplace thing, and so it's very difficult to do that, and that's why support is really important, as well as hopefully changing the industry as well.
Thank you So I want to move on to, I do want to talk about online harassment a little later on in the conversation, because I think it's one of the most insidious things that's happening at the moment, and it seems so prevalent. But I do want to move on from that, bearing in mind that concept that you've been talking about, quite how pervasive some of the issues around sexual harassment are, to talk to Megha about, your work. You've done a lot of work with a focus on women, as the focus of certain groups of women. How much do you think the system perpetuates the harassment against certain groups of women journalists?
I think one of the key aspects about the kind of work that we do when we speak about women and underrepresented women is that visibility is key in this conversation. So if you are somebody who has a platform, whether it's from a legacy industry, or you're very good at social media, so you're very good at amping a profile and you have a brand, then you're seen and you're amplified and you're supported. And if you get a tweet that kind of negates or attacks you, then all your friends see it and can support you. However, if the system is set up where we don't even know, we can't even see these, half these women, we can't see the fixers. I saw Sally Hayden in the audience there, because she could probably talk about this kind of more, in that people that travel a lot, people that are freelance journalists and who use stringers and translators, these are the women who are very vulnerable in our industry, and they're often women of colour, and they're not women's stories that we can even hear. We can't even, access them to hear what is happening to them. So I want to say thank you to the 8 men in this audience. This is the most number of men that we have ever, 9, so I can see you at the back. I'm not including the men who are being paid to be here, but all volunteers here, but this is the most number of men we've ever had at an event. So I'm really heartened to see the 8 men in this audience. Thank you for that. I want to read a message that a friend of ours who's in Second Source, she hasn't said if it's okay to say her name. She said it's okay to read this message that she got yesterday from reporting an article that she wrote about Enoch Powell. There's a word that I'm not going to say in this, because I debated about whether to say it, but I'm not going to say this word. So the message she got is, "Hey, N-word, coon bitch. You keep running that feces-smelling mouth of yours, and you're going to get that dick slapped out of your mouth. You fucking N-words keep shit on social media, and something might happen to your nappy-headed blue gum ass. Keep running that yapper, coon." So this is one message that she got yesterday, and I can think of dozens of messages that I've got with the P word, and it's because I spoke to Hannah about this earlier, going, is this sexual harassment because it's trolling or whatever, but always there's some reference to a dick, or there's some demeaning message like that, and we need to really be active in even knowing who the women of colour are in this industry, because we know some of the superstar journalists, we know some of the superstar foreign journalists, but there are women who are going to Yemen who are coming back with videos that they're not in, and they don't have the bylines, they don't have the kind of superstar profile, but they're coming back with information that goes on the news at 10, that have bylines that have news lines that you guys are all hearing about, but they have the way the system's set up, they're not seen in the same way that superstar reporters are seen or brand journalists are seen. So if this system, one of the things that we want to do with Second Source is to create not only a sisterhood, but we want to invite men into this conversation at some point as well, maybe just not yet, but at some point where we want to know, because if you don't know, you don't know. If you don't know that, stringers are at the mercy of certain correspondents, or you don't know that certain freelance women of colour can't have the access to the same, networks of support that we have. Me as a staff journalist now, I feel way more protected than I did when I was living out in Congo. So, but if you don't know, you don't know. So we want to create a situation that not only do we know, but it doesn't become like a hashtag that we have stopped clicking on because the impetus is kind of gone.
Thank you, Megha, and I appreciate that reading out that email was probably a really difficult thing for you to do, and I think it's Thank you for that. I mean, I salute the bravery of every single woman who does this kind of work. I was at a event in November, an organisation called News Exchange, and I had the privilege of sitting on a panel with three rather amazing women who had all been trolled and horrifically abused. And we started off the panel with 2 minutes worth of using the words and phrases that people had sent to them, including words that we all felt very, very uncomfortable reading, and perhaps even more uncomfortable hearing, and suggestions of things that people wanted to do. From an online harassment perspective, women journalists are 3 times more likely to be harassed than male journalists, and almost always that harassment becomes sexualized. So it's this notion that their voices have to be silenced, and they're silenced by using phrases such as, "I'm going to put my dick in your mouth," which is obviously about pretty much as unpleasant as a threat as you could get, sometimes happening at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're not quite in your journalism headspace. So you're at a very, very vulnerable stage. I do just want to ask you one more question around this kind of sense of the vulnerability of freelance journalists, which I think that Jasmine is also going to talk to a little bit. But, you know, okay, so you're out in a conflict zone or perhaps an area of insecurity, and a lot of the jobs you're asked to do are difficult as of themselves, in of themselves. How much more difficult is it to be a woman of colour in that situation, women journalists of colour?
Well, I mean, if you think about foreign news reporters now, in the UK, I mean, how many people of colour can you guys even name, really? I mean, because the ones that you hear about are the, you know, I'm not going to bring class into it, even though I probably should, but they're white, generally, and a lot of them are men. There are some younger women coming in, which is great, but who are the women of colour? They're there, but you're not hearing about them. One of the things that I want to talk about, especially in conflict reporting and foreign news reporting, is there's a lot of narrative about earning your stripes in this industry, as in, I did a 46-hour shift, and I was sort of being shot at by, look at Frank Gardner, he's in a wheelchair, he got shot at by rebels in Saudi Arabia, and you're complaining about someone feeling you up under a table? I mean, this was an actual conversation that happened. This is not like a nebulous thing that I'm plucking from the air. So, as women, I mean, as a minority woman, because those are part of the stories that I tell, that I've chosen to tell. Nobody's kind of put me in that bracket of saying, you're a woman of colour, tell women of colour stories, but I have access to them, I speak the languages, and I want to tell these stories. However, I do think that even we have I think WhatsApp's proved such a great tool for us communicating with each other, but we do have, in London, we have WhatsApp groups where it is lots of women of colour, and I think that black women have their own space, which I think is even more important because the system works against them more than it does Asian women, I think. So we talk to each other very privately in these spaces, and the things that are shared in that space, the demeaning, there's a very famous news reporter who's actually at this conference, but I won't name him. I can't name him, but he went to an Africa party, and he asked all the black women there to twerk, and it's kind of, it starts as small, or however you choose to define what the scale is here, but it starts as demeaning and sexualizing and silencing at so many levels. But if you're not even seen, so you don't have the 10,000 followers on Twitter, and you haven't been nominating yourself for awards because A, you can't afford to, or B, your company has chosen you not to be the person that they amplify. These are the kind of things that mean that you don't have a profile to who do you even... We met a fantastic woman yesterday at a panel who I'd never even heard of, and she's done some of the most amazing work, but because she hasn't self-promoted in the same way or been promoted in the same way, we didn't even know about her. So I do think that that's a structural challenge that we need to all acknowledge in this room, that happens to women of colour more than it happens to white women, and more than and maybe middle class women of colour are perhaps given an entry in in ways that working class women aren't as well. So these are things that but to start that, I'm going to be quiet in a minute, let you talk. But one of the ways that we want to challenge that is when all these conversations started, how it was happening was they were pitting people against each other to have some sort of this kind of conflict on air, where it's like, you feel this way and I think it's ridiculous. So, what's a clumsy pass under the table? I mean, that's just nothing. And so what happened was 3 minutes of airtime that was just two people shouting at each other, and nothing was solved from it at all. And that's the way our government works. That's the way so much works in our day-to-day life. And clearly it's not working. I mean, what's being solved?
Certainly the generational aspect was one that people were pitted against each other. So, I don't necessarily like to think of myself as an old journalist, but I've been in business for nearly 20 years, and there were people saying to me, well, you guys who started in the late 90s wouldn't understand. I'm going to, in a moment, turn to Jasmine. I've got a dear friend who I started my career with, who's in the audience, who's just poked her head that way, who I may ambush afterwards. Her name's Jane Barrett. She's one of the managers at Reuters. She's an absolutely exceptional journalist. I would like to ambush you a little later on if you'll stay in the room, please, and just ask about how, from a position, and I'm sure you'll agree, of an element of privilege, you as a woman can help perhaps turn some of the narrative and help support younger journalists to come along. We'd love to hear from you if you will stay with us. Thank you. But I'm going to turn to Jasmine, because Jasmine, we've spoken about this notion of pitting other people against each other. We've also spoken about this notion of other groups of women journalists, such as women journalists who aren't quite as privileged, who are especially vulnerable. Can you talk to us a bit about your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it very frustrating that the conversation is all being about fractions of women and how women fight against each other. And as one of our co-founders, Ros, said, women are never paid more than when they slag off other women. And instead of looking at sexual harassment as a serious problem, there's been a lot of talk in the commentariat about discrediting younger women, discrediting their experiences, and not making out that feminism as a whole is a human rights issue, but it's a generational problem where, feminism is not seen in that scheme of moderation. It's seen as something outrageous, or still something where we have to fight to be like, yeah, this is still on the table, and no, we're not done talking. So I started out my career in 2016 as a freelance journalist. So I've covered everything from lifestyle reporting right through to investigative journalism, which is what I'm involved in now. And what I noticed very early on was the amount of significantly older men who were senior editors of publications who would not have really known of me unless it was through, say, Twitter, other networking events where, like many women in the industry, I was targeted and told that they would mentor me and that they would take me out for coffee and that they would promise me X, Y, and Z. And, not that I want to set myself apart from other people. I think one of the compelling issues in journalism is the fact that women are still seen as a minority and some kind of strange extra figure in journalism. But from there, I was naive. I've come from, a working class background, first person to go to university. I didn't know any other journalists, especially not from Hull. So I took those coffees, and then those coffees turned into groping. Those coffees turned into incessant messages at midnight, and I thought, wow, this is not the job that I thought that I'd signed up for. And then with freelancing, my work was so incredibly precarious. I was getting my foot in the door. I felt like it was amazing for me to even be there, so I needed to sit down and I needed to shut up, which was completely at odds with the way that I'm made. I'm very much a feminist. And through that year, I kind of had to deal with this bubbling resentment, and I slowly started to turn to the women towards me and realised that I was very not alone. There were several men that we all knew about, and that this was something that we needed to discuss on a wider scale. And I want other women to know who are starting out in journalism that it's not always going to be like this. And at Second Source, we are here for you whenever you need that.
I think it's a particular worry, and Jasmine, thank you so much for saying that, because, we've all, coffees that turned to late night texts, that turned into knocks on the hotel door, that turned into expectations of something more. I remember when I'm 41 now, well, next month, and I remember early on in my career when I was mid-20s, a senior media executive invited me back to his home for a chat about how I might advance my career, and then turning into a conversation around how his marriage was falling apart. And it's just that because you feel vulnerable, because you feel that you have to, in somehow, they're in power, they have the power role, you have to go along with it. And the questions that you're then forced to ask yourself, and then in the comments from other people about, well, why did you do that then? That was a really stupid thing to do, wasn't it? And actually, no, it shouldn't be about that. It should be, why did he do that? Yeah? So, Jasmine, thank you. Thank you for kind of speaking about an aspect of a group of journalists that we often don't hear about. We need to find allies, people of privilege, in positions of privilege, white women like me, white middle-class, Oxford-educated women like me, who are privileged, have to be able to say, yeah, I get that I'm privileged, and I want to carry on the conversation. I want to try and shape and help the narrative change. So, Jasmine, thank you again for that. I want to just ask you about this notion that we've spoken a little bit about, the sexual harassment, where it comes from. We heard you say that it was editors, but a lot of the time I speak to news organisations, they say, well, actually, it's always about the sources. It's not always about the sources. Often it's more comfortable for news organisations to say it's about the sources because they don't have to turn the mirror on themselves. But sometimes it is about the sources, isn't it? And how do we deal with that? How do we help people prepare themselves and mitigate the risks that they might face?
I think at this point it's good to look at the informal nature of journalism and how we operate through the ranks, and as a whole kind of look at, especially in British journalism, I know that this won't apply to everyone, but it's a network where everyone knows everyone and everyone's business is on the table. Whatever you do, people know it and they track it, and you sometimes learn that in a really horrible way. And because of that, that's when you don't want to question things like if a source, operates in that fashion, or someone else on your level operates in that fashion. I think it's knowing that people are operating at every single level, yet no one really takes that seriously, and knowing that these people are at the top and the people who are at the side, everywhere there's an impact and there's no real scheme of support. Sorry to make that so general, but I think that's really what we need to get at here. The fact is that no one is taking it seriously. So what I think we really need is some kind of independent advocacy, which we hope to carry through Second Source, where we kind of have a union-style representative who people in certain newsrooms can go to, or hopefully we have roaming representatives that would be able to assist people if they have these concerns, or if they have found that a source has, overstepped that barrier. I think it's making sure that you have people like you at every step of the way that understand and say, look, this is a valid concern.
Thank you. Can I turn to you, Jane? Do you mind me coming to you in the audience? So Jane Barrett, I can't remember your full extraordinary title at Reuters, but we've got a microphone here. You've got one there. Jane, can you give us a sense of a little bit about perhaps what somebody like you in your situation might be able to do to help support younger journalists or more vulnerable communities of journalists who just don't know what to do and where to turn?
Yeah, so I think it's about a sort of a two-way relationship. It's quite scary to come to a senior manager. I still feel like I'm 23, right? I mean, I'm not. So I think that I'm thoroughly approachable and that anyone can come and speak to me. But it's not true, because there's a hierarchy. Jasmine, you're saying it's a very informal industry that we live in, and yet it's a very hierarchical industry as well. It's a really bizarre mixture. So I feel it's very much about making yourself available and reaching out to, as you say, women, younger women, but also anyone who might be feeling a bit more on the vulnerable side within the newsroom. And we've got a global newsroom. We have 2,500 journalists in 160 countries. So making yourself available and making people know that it's a safe space. I also feel it's absolutely incumbent on those of us who've been around for a few more years to talk openly with people about how we got to where we are, and to understand what we've got, either by nature or by nurture, and then make it possible for others to get the same thing. And I just give you 2 examples. Actually, this coming Thursday, we're going to have a WebEx conversation around Europe, Middle East and Africa about exactly this topic, about sexual harassment, both within the newsroom and also from sources. HR is aware, HR is not going to be on the call, and it's actually going to be led by, I think, 5 people, all of whom are active journalists, actively in the newsroom, who have suffered this at their, themselves. And I think just by being honest, and by opening the discussion and saying, I was touched up by the chairman of a major company here in Italy at a dinner, it happened. It's kind of, I think, the liberation of the Me Too thing and actually broadening that out within a company and saying there is no shame, there is no stigma, and you need to come forward because this is unacceptable behavior in the newsroom and there will be consequences. And it's unacceptable behavior from outside the newsroom and we will support you. So that's one thing. Secondly, away from the sexual harassment situation, but more in the how do you as a woman get up through the ranks of a news organization that might still be predominantly male-dominated or male behavior-dominated. We did a survey of the women at Reuters, I think in January, so saying, what are some of the tips and techniques that you want? Like, what are some of the things that you want to learn? And amazingly, by far the biggest response was, how do I own my place at the table? In a news meeting or in a press conference, how do I own my space? How do I speak well? How do I have the confidence to speak? And it was just such a wake-up call to me because it's been some years since that was my biggest issue. And there are people older than me who are having that issue. So we've got a session at the end of this month, I think 26th, on exactly that, so gravitas. How do you own your space? How do you speak in public? How do you get over the nerves? Just really, really practical tips. That one's specifically for women, but we are going to then do another session, I think, the following month for anyone who wants those sorts of tips. Because I do think that other vulnerable communities within the news agencies, the news organizations, do just need to feel that somebody else is there putting the next stepping stone in front of them or helping them across it.
Can I ask you one more question? How
Please.
do we engage male news managers to not feel like we are kind of provoking some kind of them and us scenario? How do we get male allies into the conversation to help change the situation?
That's a really good question, and I've had both really excellent ones and absolute dinosaurs that I've just wanted to throw out the window, frankly. We honestly, we had a major managers' news meeting, and we're talking about diversity as just general. And one of the senior male managers stood up and said, right, but the thing is that you've still got to have quality, right? And you're like, what the fuck? So there are some people you're not going to bring around. In any piece of change, there are some people who you're just not going to bring around. And what I've learned is to ignore them and to freeze them out. Because honestly, they're not going to come around. They're just not. So you've got your champions. Get them to speak about it as much as humanly possible. So our editor here in EMEA is fabulous. So we get him to speak about it as much as possible. Those who kind of can be brought around, if you win them around, then they become even louder voices than the champions because they've been on a journey themselves. And eventually the blockers just kind of get snubbed. So I think use your champions and just get them to give them some talking points, give them some examples, invite them to a lunch, get a group of women in a room or a group of journalists in a room and pay for the guy's lunch. I mean, whatever it takes. I mean, you shouldn't need to do that, but just make it feel like a welcome area, saying, we need your help, will you help us, rather than it being, you lot are awful.
Thank you. And thank you, and sorry for ambushing you,
Right.
but I did know from 20 years ago that you wouldn't mind, but I mean, that's been really helpful because when we began coming up with this idea of this panel, we thought actually it would be really great to get a news manager on board, but we didn't manage. But I feel like we've got you on board. So thank you, Jane. I do want to just turn a little bit again back to Jasmine to talk about some of the, because we're talking about solutions here. So we've been talking for half an hour now. I want to bring some more questions in a moment, but I wanted to talk about, okay, we kind of have a sense of what the problem is. We kind of have a sense of what some of the perpetrators are. What can we do? What are we doing? What is Second Source doing? How does Second Source need help? What are the gaps? What is the space? What is the next step? Jasmine?
Where we're at right now, and where I hope we always will be, is about actions, not just words. And I'm already sick of people saying that they have reporting fatigue about Me Too. Because, not only does that, what happened with Me Too and the rampant sexual harassment and abuse that haunts women's lives, not only does that haunt their professional life, but it haunts their personal life too. This is a double-edged sword here. So with that in mind, we're looking at action being so important because there's that risk of harassment. There's these kind of strange caveats with patronage coming from the wrong places, and it's leading a lot of women into positions of vulnerability. And with that in mind, we set up a mentorship scheme, which is led by Jessica Elgort of The Guardian. And basically with that scheme, we're looking to speak to and mentor women in the first 5 years of their journalism career, and non-binary people as well. We want to make this as intersectional and as accessible as possible, because we think it's really important that we make sure that everyone is represented where they possibly can be. Because, like I said, it's enough of a battle to get women to be considered on equal footing in a newsroom, never mind other intersectional concerns. I'm a queer journalist. With that in mind, dear God, no one really speaks about what happens to lesbians and bisexual women. That's also a major concern. So with that, the mentorship scheme is the first port of call. And then secondly, we're also looking at the way panels such as this are composed. So as you can see, we're all women. We're all women. We have one woman of colour with us as well. And with that in mind, we looked at other panels and we thought, oh wow, there is a lot of pale still males dominating these conversations. No wonder no one is really getting through and being able to change the narrative and change the culture in a newsroom. And the visibility.
Yeah, sorry. This is your idea, but I'm just going to jump in just quickly, because for the aspect that we were talking about earlier, which is if you don't know who these women are, and they're there, and they're in all the zones, and they're doing the excellent work, then we're not going to be able to amplify them and protect them the same way you would, superstar brand journalist. So with that in mind, Jazz came up with a fantastic idea, which is...
Oh my goodness. We haven't been training. I do have an A-level in theatre studies. Might come apparent. But yeah, with that in mind, we're going to be launching a panel pledge. With that pledge, we are looking to get as many journalists, as many newsrooms as possible to sign up to say that as a journalist, if there are 3 people or more on that given panel, they will only appear on that panel if a woman is there and a person of colour is there. And it's something we're all very much behind. Thanks. The one.
The one caveat that we have for this is that, because we ideally in every situation that is what we completely want, right? A person and a woman of color, a person of color and a woman. However, as one of our friends said, the way the industry is set up, because it's 94% in London, it's 94% male and 55% white. So that might not always be the situation. And if you go to the Conservative Party conference, or you have 3 founders of an organisation, you've been asked to chair it, and you're a woman and you work in tech, and those 3 founders are from Silicon Valley and all, white bros from Harvard, what are you going to be saying no to that? Well, then what we want to do is then ask the organizer to explain why this panel can't be diverse. So you are forced to have that uncomfortable conversation to say, why is it not possible to have a woman or a person of colour and a person of colour in this conversation. So it's not something that's just brushed aside. Because can we change it immediately? Probably not. But that's, yeah, so we, as many of you can get involved in that, we would love that.
Thank you. And Jane, I mean, I'm really struck by this notion of what you're saying about younger women feeling that they don't have a place at the table. And I'm also really struck by some of the work that you're doing in terms of helping support younger women to find their voice. And I wonder whether that is something that possibly could be scaled out and kind of that Second Source might be able to get involved with, effectively pinpointing a series of really awesome, kick-ass women in the media, like Jane, who could say, actually, you know what? We can run a webinar for a wider audience around finding your place and your voice at the table. I mean, something like that could be really great. We have a question from Diane. Yep.
Can I suggest, so I'm Diane Kemp, I'm from the Broadcast Journalism Training Council, and I apologise because it's UK-based, but come and speak to trainers as well, come and speak to universities. You'll find that there's a load of people to line up alongside you. There's academic Manel Watch, which is about looking at panels and pointing up when they are all old blokes, which they often are. So that there's, ways in which you could, be more than the sum of your parts by being with us. But I just think come and speak to trainee students who are going to be journalists, because partly it would help inform them before they go off on placements, to get them to think about some of those things. But there's a positive side to it as well, that sense of actually feeling more powerful rather than making them feel scared about it. So I think there would be something if you could come and speak, certainly at a BJTC conference.
Thank you. And we don't want to scare people off journalism, because it is one of the best, I think it's the best profession in the entire world, right? So and we want these brilliant, diverse voices. We don't want people to kind of go, oh my God, it's just too much of a scary proposition being a journalist. It's awesome. I want to talk a little bit about online harassment in a moment, but I do want to turn to Megha again. Is there anything else you wanted to add around some of those specific kind of gaps that need to be filled?
It's just expanding slightly on the point that you made earlier, which is the reason I'm even here right now is because, I mean, we know what the BBC is like when it comes to impartiality and not letting people talk, and for a good reason. That's why it's the biggest and best, in my opinion, in the world. But the reason I'm here is because I have an awesome boss who is all the things in that list. He's a white man who went to Oxford, who's very middle class, and when all of this started, when Second Source started, even prior to that, when he could see how uncomfortable I was getting, because these are triggering conversations, they bring a lot of things back that you've suppressed and you felt that you haven't been able to talk about for years and years, and he was so supportive in leveraging his authority to make sure that I could even take part in panels like this and do more events and cover the story, because he trusted that I still had the impartiality to be able to cover an important story. So I did a story a couple of weeks ago on harassment among undocumented refugees in the UK, because we can't hear about it, because if they report it, because there's no firewall between deportation services and the police, which means that the women who have reported it are detained and sent back. So that was and I knew that there was an editorial conversation saying, should I have been the right person to have told that story, considering I take such a big stance in this. But he insisted that I did, because I had the access and these women were comfortable to talk to me. So I do the issues of allies in this is very important, because when we do talk about meritocracy and earning your way into this, the kind of, if the system is set up by goats, then the goat is going to excel at it. We want fishes and giraffes, and we want the diversity of voices in this, because you get the access and the stories that there's no way certain journalists would have been able to go into the houses that I got to get the stories that I got to, because those women wouldn't have spoken to him. So it's kind of needing the allies and using any privilege that you have to use it, and come to conversations as well. So just quickly, I did a panel on women of colour, and it was kind of similar setup to this, in that majority of the audience were women of colour, and there was like Louise, and then maybe 2 other white women in the audience, and I was like so grateful to Louise that she chose to come to that, because I think a lot of women saw that and thought, oh, that's their space, so we don't need to come to that. But what we're doing is like talking to a room full of people who are converted. So go back to your newsroom and get the guys involved, you know, because this is important. This is all our issue.
And I'd echo what Jazz has said. It's bloody awesome that we've got so many men in the room. This is the conversation. I've been having these conversations for years, and this is one of the best turns out in terms of gender balance in this conversation. So thank you so much to all of our male colleagues and friends for being here. We really appreciate it. I just want to turn, before I take a question from the audience, to Louise. It's not always that easy to find allies, is it? And sometimes I think that, you know, when you're talking to newsrooms, it's not always easy to reach the people you need to reach in terms of understanding what the policies are, or the, you know, how you understand what's going on in the newsroom and where perhaps you can shift change.
Yeah, I think one of the stats from your research was really important is that something like, I think 50% of the harassment incidents that were reported in that research were in the newsroom, which should be the easiest place to create change. If it's within an office, it's an organisation. Bosses hopefully have a handle and have some power over shaping the culture of their organisation. But we don't always get to choose our bosses. I'm very lucky my boss Polly is here, and I've worked in great, generally digital organisations that have been really progressive. They've had really lots of women at the top, which makes a huge difference. But I think I have a big bugbear about the culture of newsrooms, and it's often, I think, legacy newsrooms, so more old-fashioned journalism, or perhaps people who are still acting in that way, in which journalism used to be even more male-dominated than it is in some circumstances today, and it means that we operate as lone wolves. People who are reporters, you're isolated, you're fighting to try and get a good story and present it to your editor, and the editor's always right. And you know, it's a wonderful, stimulating business, but it's a tough business. And it means that I don't think we've developed enough of a culture in newsrooms where we really genuinely care about each other, and there's a sense of togetherness and a team. As I say, I've worked at HuffPost and BuzzFeed, which are both sort of digital, and I think that means they have a lot more emphasis on culture, which is pretty great. But then lots of other places I've heard about, you've still got that Fleet Street mentality where people are fighting and fighting and fighting. So the last thing you want to do is reveal a weakness to your boss or your manager. You know, you've worked really hard to get there. As we've discussed, there's tons of barriers for different groups, in particular, getting into journalism. So I think in terms of shaping this, it is about finding those allies. It's about companies promoting women. We could have a whole separate talk about the gender pay gap and all that kind of thing. But what we're trying to do for the mentorship scheme we're doing, for example, is just start forming those networks and making them stronger, sort of formalising them a bit. And with the mentoring, we're particularly focusing on women who might want to drop out of journalism for whatever reason. And basically, rather than rewarding people who are great journalists, which obviously should also be done, it's people who are struggling. We've openly said with this scheme, do you feel you have a lack of confidence? Do you feel like you might drop out? Do you not know where to turn? Are you experiencing harassment? Do you have trouble with office politics? And so we want to help them, which I think some mental schemes sort of overlook. So they probably get people applying and polishing up their CV and sounding amazing, when actually we want people to be open with us if they can about struggles, so that we can really, really help them. And hopefully that's a really compassionate thing that's missing from a lot of really competitive industries, I think.
Thank you. I just want to make 2 points which have come out in conversations I've had with my colleagues here and over again in conversations around sexual harassment. So just before I forget them, basically. One is that our industry is a slightly strange one, in that sometimes the relationships that we end up having with colleagues are particular. So I've spent many years overseas. I've spent many years in quite difficult situations, and sometimes that difficulty brings people together in quite awkward ways sometimes. Sometimes in a sense that, you know, I lived in Haiti in the past, for instance, and, you know, it was a very male-dominated industry, and there was a sense of entitlement on the part of certain men who thought that they could get a certain way with me, for instance. Equally, you know, I've heard of friends who have had flings with people or extramarital affairs. That's not uncommon in our industry. That makes it slightly difficult when you're talking about sexual harassment, because often what happens is, there may be a relationship that's going on that is consensual, and sometimes that relationship goes from being consensual to non-consensual, and that in itself is quite a peculiar grey area where we have to be cognizant to some of the kind of more complex aspects of our industry as well. And also, in the foreign side, a lot of the times we're in conflict zones, perhaps, a lot of the people working there are quite male, or as Jane said, there's male behaviour going on, which sometimes tends to support more of a harassment approach, which is obviously not on. The second point I want to make before there's a question from a colleague back in the audience there is I just want to read out some 5 brilliant points that there's an amazing lady called Mary Hamilton who used to be executive editor for, I've entirely forgotten her job, communities at The Guardian. And she did a lot of work on online communities and online conversations and supporting her colleague journalists to combat and understand online harassment. So there's 5 tips, and they work, I think, across sexual harassment, but predominantly on online harassment. I will tweet them later if it's of help. One is anticipating campaigns of abuse that target the journalist, the organisation, and the entire concept of reporting. The second one is preparing for the worst attacks before they happen. And somebody asked me yesterday, how do we fight back against this? And I said to them, we don't fight back necessarily, we fight forwards. We plan things in advance, we support people in advance, we assess risks in advance. This is as much appropriate in online harassment as it is in physical and sexual harassment. This is really key because I think it plays to both what Megha and Jasmine have also said is sometimes it's not always appropriate or applicable, but where possible, commission diverse writers on diverse topics to mitigate their personal risks. Because a lot of time online, you'll see, say, a woman of colour is writing about an issue to do with race, and she's hideously trolled because, as Tracy Powell was talking earlier on today about race, she said, just because you write about race doesn't make you racist. But in some platforms, people think that is the case. So that's really important. Designing your systems and tools to minimise harassment and harm is the other one. And then the final one, as we've spoken about a bit, is addressing this starts right from the very top, right from the top. And it goes through line managers and it affects the entire organisation. No exceptions. So there, Mary Hamilton, as I say, she's at NewsMary on Twitter. She's brilliant. Her points that she made at News Exchange with me about online harassment, but I think there's some crossover in sexual harassment terms as well. I'll stop. There was a question from a colleague back there in the audience. Can you identify yourself and then ask your question?
Yes, I can. I'm Anna. I'm a journalist from Switzerland, and I found it very interesting what you were saying, and it's not like specifically on sexual harassment now, because I don't think that there is any discussion, or the facts are the facts and we all know about it, but I have the feeling of I really also want to think about how much is it me, or how much is it my emotional insecurity, how much you're completely right with the thing that it's a system and there is patriarchy and there is a whole shit going on, but sometimes I really feel that it is also us. It's also, I don't know, if I'm in a session and it's about what is relevant to our readers, and everybody is going like this, and then I'm pushing once, pushing twice, and then it's oh my God, they're not listening to me. I don't really think if it's what is good, so I'm not sure enough. I'm not sure anymore if my feminist topic was the newest shit on earth. And so, and maybe I should, and maybe sometimes I should say, well, that's very inappropriate, Mr. Stephen. We are in a conversation, so please bullying me. Don't, stop bullying me. So my question, or for the discussion, would be, where do you feel is it, every woman, or what is our responsibility in this thing? Not to just blame the system, just, where can we improve in this discussion as individuals?
It's clear. I don't propose that I've got the exact answer that you're looking for, but just, I think you should be mindful of some of the language that you've just used. You've used words like emotion, disempowering words, because you've used words like emotional, and there was another word they used that I can't quite remember, but in that you've told yourself that perhaps you're in a weaker position than you really are, because and we've all been, you know, like as a woman of colour, if you try and argue passionately about something, the word aggressive will be thrown at you. And I've spoken to lots of my lovely, you know, friends from the home counties, and they've never had that. And then these are pit bull women as well, so they've never had that word thrown at them. But what I stopped doing was like calling it out as soon as I did it to myself and someone else did it to me. I'm not being emotional. I'm having emotions because I'm a human being. But you are not going to make me feel wrong about this. The definition of sexual harassment as defined by the UN is a compromise of your dignity. So if you feel that, then as an adult, that's enough to know that you've got a starting point to go from. This industry is about egos, you know? Like this, I mean, whether we like it or not, and it's about global gossip, whether you're like, you know, everyone talks and everyone amps themselves up, and that's not a bad thing. You know, it is the best profession in the world, I think, as well. But I don't think it's, you know, there is no easy solution to get confident, because people would be, yeah.
The point is that I'm quite confident, so I never had this issue. So
Yeah.
So
but if you're a woman in that
situation,
situation,
I know that I'm bossy and persistent
Yeah.
enough that I tell you know, I always get the payment I want, because
Yeah.
I say, well, why should I get less?
Yeah.
So that's not my problem, but I know when I talk to so many friends, and like in every newsroom I sense that a lot of women have these insecurities, and I think it's very important not just to blame the system. I don't say that anyone is blaming the system.
We talk about that quite a lot.
To talk about our own insecurity and what it causes, like, you know, energetically, and maybe
one
to
of the
tell
things
more
that we
people
think
to be more confident and just say, well, that's my idea, and my idea is fucking great.
Well, you could try
know,
doing what the women,
exaggerating, but,
you know, the women in the Obama administration, they did this thing called amplification. So whenever one woman said an idea in the meeting, they'd say, well, as Louise just said, because otherwise men were taking credit for these ideas, like, you know, 2 meetings down the road. So amplifying other women is always a good idea, I think.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from a man, and a man's just put his hand up. Thank you. Don't feel intimidated. It's okay. We're only women.
As you mentioned, there's sort of a cultural issue as well, but then like a more institutional one inside the organizations. Considering you're all journalists, how do you plan to tackle the other parts of the institution, such as HR, which has been a problem with this issue in media organizations? Because it's not just editorial. How are you going to deal with it?
So we're actually trying to do something within Second Source, which is not going incredibly well, but we're continuing with our mission, but it's quite telling that it's been quite difficult. One of our aims when we set out a few months ago and started was to try and collect sexual harassment policies from all of the industry, which means contacting HR, and we're also contacting bosses as well in some cases. We haven't done very well on that. That may be because we're a small unknown group and we are sometimes emailing from personal emails. There could be reasons for that, but we haven't had good feedback. We haven't had people saying no, but we haven't had much response, or people have delayed it, which was disappointing for us, because part of our mission, and we're still very much into that mission, is working with organisations. You know, we want to do activism, but we're not sort of against the journalism organisations. The whole point is that cultural change comes from the top, and it should do. But HR is a really interesting point, because I've personally not had bad experiences with HR in journalism, but I've heard lots of stories, whether they're true or not, which things like HR passing on confidential information without warning them. I had someone who said they told HR they were pregnant, and then HR told their boss before they told them, things like that. Whether they're true or not, they put people off trusting HR. And it means, and of course HR is a part of the company that represents the company, so there are important points there. I've worked in places that are unionising or have unionised, and part of that is to do with people wanting independent representation. I think most of us feel, or speak up if you don't, that in terms of sexual harassment, it's often really good to have an independent sort of outside thing, and we want to offer that support to people, but maybe organisations like Vice Media have had big problems with this in the UK, and they brought in sort of independent bodies, and I think that's quite important if you've got a serious problem, to have someone truly independent to talk to, because half of the problem is reporting, as we've touched on. So I can't say I know. We had someone at one of our talks, actually, that Hannah was with as well. There was an HR person in the audience at a talk we did a while ago, and we were so pleased because she said all the HR people are starting to mobilise around this and have some sort of movement, which sounded really, really exciting. Not working in HR, I can't say for sure the ins and outs of how HR works, but it's definitely something that is problematic. And I say whether it's justified or not, there's low trust in HR in companies, and that is a problem because I don't think many people would go to HR about these sorts of problems, as far as I can tell.
I'd just make a point that obviously there's the issue of NDAs as well, which is one that is a really tricky one to talk about. So those who may not be familiar with the term, it's non-disclosure agreements. And what has often happened, or we believe has happened because we generally don't know, is that people are effectively made to sign something and paid off and kind of maybe disappear into the sunset or somewhere else. When there's some suggestions around sexual harassment. And that's a difficult one. That's a really difficult one. I would just say that of the news organisations I've spoken with at INSI, a lot of organisations have got confidential kind of phone numbers or confidential kind of whistleblower hotlines. And it's not just for people who are experiencing sexual harassment, but that can be part of it. Jane, can I just ask you one more question, please? You mentioned before when you were talking about your WebEx that HR wasn't going to be involved. How important is it that both you can have conversations outside of HR, but then you also involve them as well?
So the call will be across about 45 countries. And the way that our company is structured, some HR is much closer in relationship terms. So in the UK, our HR is very close to us and we speak to them a lot and they would be fine to be on it. In other places, we share HR with other parts of the overall Thomson Reuters group. And that's where there's been a bit of a lack of trust, to our colleague's point. The relationship just hasn't been that close. It's been much more transactional, so much more payroll contracts and that sort of malarkey. So again, I think it does come down to relationships. And as with several of the answers in the discussion, I think it also does come down to the fact of having people within your immediate sort of working community helping each other along. So there's been an active decision to exclude HR from the call on Thursday so that people feel that they are able to speak whichever country they're in. If there are then issues which we feel need to be escalated, we have different independent HR people who work across the globe. We've got one woman who's based in New York, for example, who's head of diversity and support. So she might get involved or offer some help if people want it without having to put people into the odd position where in some countries, there's a male HR person who might be around for the last 30 years and be mates with all the people who sort of, being inappropriate. So it's about giving people options. I do think, I've got very good relationships with our HR guys. I think they've been excellent. We've had a couple of situations where they've just dealt with it incredibly fast, incredibly swiftly, and assuming that the person who's brought the case is telling exactly the truth rather than assuming not, which I've heard, sadly, situations in other companies like that. But I do think it comes down to relationship. I feel very confident in our HR because I know them very well. I can imagine that if you're a stringer in Côte d'Ivoire, you might not have that same confidence.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have I'm going to ask for my colleagues to give final comments in a moment because I think we've got about 10 minutes left, but I'm quite keen to see if anybody else has any other questions from the floor. There's a lady there and then I've got three. So I'll take you three back to back, as it were, if that's okay, the three questions together, and then we'll get responses and then we may... Do you want to identify yourself and then...
Yeah, my name's Polly Curtis. I'm Editor-in-Chief of HuffPost UK. If there's one thing your boss could do for you to improve the culture in your office with respect to what we've been talking about today, what could they do? Louise, we can talk about it afterwards.
Polly is my boss, so...
Thanks. Should we just take all three questions together and then we can process those questions while we're... There's a lady here on the front, the lady with the red pink top. Yep.
Hi. I was wondering...
Can you identify yourself?
Yes, I'm Lexi Flegger and I'm a student. I was wondering, what can a young female journalist who's new into the journalism world and really looking to start her career and move up and advance her journalism career, what steps should she take realistically when she is faced with a situation where a male boss of hers or someone higher up in her company or someone that's very important for her to have a relationship with, a working relationship with, when he does touch her inappropriately or in any way sexually assaults her or sexually harasses her to any degree, but she is in a working relationship with this person and she doesn't want to just up and move and leave her career.
Is she employed or is she freelance?
She employed,
Okay.
maybe. So,
Okay.
I mean,
Thank
because getting a different job, it's hard, and
Sure.
realistically, what can she do?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question.
Thank
So
you.
we'll come back to you in a
Thank you.
moment. But our male colleague in the front there.
Jasper Jackson, the digital editor of the New Statesman. Just to say, I'm really keen on the HR policies if you ever come up with them, because I know ours are probably a bit outdated. I'd love to try and get them updated.
We're trying.
So, I mean, I'd like to think I'm relatively up on these issues and try and think about a lot of the stuff that's discussed and try and apply it. But I'm also aware that I am a product of the patriarchy myself, and I do a lot of unconscious stuff that I'm sure is maybe problematic in meetings, etc., and I'm chairing news meetings. Are there any quite simple tips that you can give someone who's in a position where I manage a big team of women to ensure that the kind of unconscious things that I do don't suppress people with ideas, don't make people feel that they can't share their ideas as effectively as they would do if my behaviour wasn't sort of unconsciously suppressing it?
Thanks, Jasmine. And actually, the fact that you've asked that question, I think, is bloody brilliant. And I think it's the first step to actually finding the answer. So I'm not going to answer that question. One of our colleagues is. You have Polly's. You have an answer for Polly, or do you have a?
I think because Polly's my boss.
Okay. Okay. Jasmine and Megha, what was the one thing that your boss could do for you?
I think the best thing you can offer is pastoral care, some level of empathy, some one-on-one meeting, just where it's not particularly about work. I think it should be about life as a whole. You don't have to be best friends with your employee, of course, but I think it's knowing that you have some personal and trust and respect for that person. I mean, I know in my job I get trolled a lot, heaven forbid, supporting trans people. But it's things like that, those kind of smaller scale aggressions that take place every day that sometimes, your boss doesn't have time to account for or consider in your working day. So just knowing that you've got some time parked out in the diary, I think is really helpful.
And this might tie in a little bit with Jasper's comment as well, which is, it's something that Jane said actually earlier, which is transparency, I think, is really key to empowering people in our industry, because I used to think that things like Forbes would just look around and pick the 30 best people to be Forbes 30 under 30. I genuinely believe that. I thought that you got the press awards because the industry looked through the work of everybody. I didn't know you paid and nominated yourself to be considered for this. I didn't know that industries put certain people forward for that. So, and unfortunately, these superstar people have not come forward in sharing that information. So I think if you're in a position of being a boss and you are sharing this, and you are seeing somebody who seems a little bit quieter and a little bit not putting themselves forward as much, be really transparent as to the steps that they can take so that they can be, and I'm not going to name and shame, but, the amplified journalists, because there's so much talent, and it's such a shame we're losing out on that. And we really are. We all are, and now we know. So now we know we have to do better.
Thank you. I just want to make one comment, one answer to your point. Firstly, you don't have to put up with it, okay? It is not a contractual obligation of your job as a journalist to have to put up with some shitty, power-obsessed male boss harassing you or abusing you. So, number one, you don't have to put up with it. Number two, you're not alone. Number three, there are organisations like this around the world. There's one in the States called Press Forward around the world, and there are women around the world who, if you feel comfortable in coming forward, or if a person feels comfortable in coming forward, or if you just want to be able to have a conversation about what is going on, there are organisations who will help you. But I want to ask Jasmine to respond to to your point, perhaps a bit more about what does this young journalist do when faced with that situation?
Yeah, I've been in that exact position, and I know how hard it is to look at the person who's meant to be responsible for you, or you're meant to work with, and think, okay, this is quite a duplicitous relationship that's going on. For me, it was just important to have those conversations with other like-minded people. I think initially I kind of kept it a bit on the back burner in my own head and kind of relegated it with other sexual trauma that I'd experienced. But then when I did start to bandy together with other like-minded female journalists, that really gave me the support I needed. I think there's a lot of stigma still around reporting and not reporting. And even though we're hoping to make that culture a lot better, there's also no shame in not reporting either. I didn't report, and I wanted to get that help in a different way. So I'd also say it's really important to not blame yourself and not internalize what that person has done to you, and find hopefully someone even in the office that you could trust and who is experienced that would be able to provide that for you. But it is fundamental to know that it's not acceptable in any given way, and you're not alone, and you shouldn't have to put up with it.
Thanks, Jasmine. We've got 2 minutes for an answer to Jasper. Louise, would you like to? Yeah.
This is a very relevant question to me because I worked somewhere previously where we had a real issue with news meetings where the older people happened to all be male and the younger people happened to mainly be female, and the younger ones didn't speak up. And the idea was it was an equal meeting where everyone would share their ideas and it would be great, but you just had the men leading the conversation and the women not speaking up or drifting off because they were interested in different things, if I'm honest. And it's a stereotype that women have less confidence. It's not always true, but it is often true. If you're a junior woman, perhaps all these different barriers we talked about, you may have low confidence. I don't think that's anyone's fault if they have low confidence, but I think if you're chairing a meeting, say it's sort of gender balanced, or there's not many women, or there's lots of women, as you said, pay attention to who isn't speaking and note that. Don't encourage the ones who just speak all the time, because they'll speak anyway and they'll be heard, and that's great. And sometimes it might not work in a public big meeting to say, and what do you actually think? But try that. If that works, that's good. What we did in this other workplace is actually spoke to people in advance and said, I'd really love to hear more from you at the meeting. Do you want to think of some ideas in advance? Because confidence can mean that you don't want to speak in a big group and you're not prepared, and it can be really intimidating. But, I don't think it's bad at all to think about those people and give them extra attention and say, I'd love to hear what you think. Do you feel comfortable talking about it in the meeting? And if they really don't, you could talk to them separately. But I think it's just really honing in on those people. And the ones who talk, they're always going to talk. So that's great for them. And, confidence is a great thing in our business. And I'm quite confident, and that's a blessing. But people don't have that. So, yeah, it's really focusing on those people openly and helping them in whatever way suits.
I think that, that brings us to a pretty decent close, because I'm getting signals from the back that I have to be quiet. But, amplification again is, I think, what Louise is saying, what we're all saying here. Solidarity. Did you have one final point? Because you're looking at me kind of going, let me.
Allow for questioning. If someone says, oh, that's a bit sexist, don't take it to heart. I've known so many people just being able to listen and allow yourself to be called out, I think, is the most important step.
I want to draw this to a close, but by thanking these brilliant colleague panellists, and also to Jane in the back, who we did ambush, as I say, and to all of you for just sticking with us and believing in it and being part of this conversation. The second source, these colleagues here, keep them in mind, keep in contact if you need any help. If you haven't felt comfortable in this scenario talking to us, you know what we look like. You've got our Twitter handles and the Twitter handle for Second Source.
We've got a website which annoyingly is possibly down at the moment, but when it is not down, it's thesecondsource.co.uk, and the Twitter handle is thesecondsource, and second is spelled 2ND. So The Second Source. So if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see the website, which will be up. We are a UK group, but we're happy to help anyone else we can as well. And we have sister organisations and things that we can pass you on to too.
And mine is at INSI News, which is predominantly safety, but obviously safety and harassment are one of the same thing in many ways. So thank you ever so much for your time, and thank you.